Hello, everybody, and welcome to V.A.C. Roundtable number 76. And we're fortunately to be joined by somebody who was with us in the past. And we're honored to have him again and to welcome him to the second time club. Welcome, Chris Coulombe. He is running for Senate again, pardon me, for Congress in California's second district. So, hello and welcome.
Thank you very much. Very happy to be here.
All right. So, with that, we usually start off asking, question: How do people come to cannabis? But you've already answered that in the previous discussion. So, we're gonna start off with a completely new set of questions. Um, so, can you tell us about your experience serving in the U.S. military for 16 years? How has it shaped your perspective on leadership as well as public service?
Well, I would find that to be a very relevant question, particularly today in today's political environment. But I was very fortunate to be a Mustang. So I started as an enlisted. I joined in 2000 as a young 18-year-old high school dropout and was taught to take care of what my lane was. And then eventually you grow larger and you start to take care of more lanes for other people and be responsible for them. And I think through that process, both as a lower enlisted and then an NCO, and then eventually getting my commission and exiting as a captain, I think the resounding thing was never do anything that you're not willing to ask someone else to do, or never ask anybody to do something you're not willing to do yourself. And so I think that is part of what has shaped me. And as we go and grow through the different levels of responsibilities in the military, we learn that there's a lot of, I think, what we might find now post career is kind of cliche phrases, but what you put into it is what you get out of it. And I think that is one of the messages that we get in politics is what we put into our, when we put our attention into is what, the quality of the product in which we get out of it. And so I believe that as we who reside in a republic are citizens of a republic, I think that is probably one of the most impactful things for us to understand. One of the biggest takeaways from my military experience was just we've got to make sure that we're putting quality in and expecting quality out. And if we don't get that quality back, then we need to check that system and find out why. So my takeaway here is what we put into our republic is what we get out of our republic. And that's kind of the military leadership message that I would convey here for this question.
Well, thank you very much. And again, it's an honor to have you again as you run again for office. Next question will be Council Member Landau. Nate, you're up.
Hey, Chris, thank you so much for being here with us.
My pleasure, Nate.
My question is, in your role as an infantry officer in the U.S. Army, what lessons did you learn about teamwork and the collaboration that you believe are applicable to political leadership? Thank you.
Yeah, we've got to make sure that we have accountability, I think is the big one. Anybody that's given responsibility, is given authority, given power, it's got to be something that you are also accountable for. We don't just hand power over to people and say, do as you will. There's a check and a balance. And sometimes that's the people within the unit. There's been scenarios where I've had to push back on orders that I was given. And I think that that's an important part of our military law. There are things in which we can do inside of the system that allow us to create checks and balances or have checks and balances in the system. And there's the kind of the bifurcation between the enlisted oath and the officer's oath. And I think we need to make sure that we have that. And one of the differences is that officers, we're not ordered to follow orders. We're not lawfully bound to follow orders. We review the orders that we are given and we decide whether or not we accept them. And then we give those orders on to the next level of the unit. And so this is something I feel really resonated with me as I went through my military service was you're not just a mindless bot. You're You're somebody who's there, who's executing technically and tactically competently in a way that accomplishes the mission, but you have to do it within, the laws of war. You have to do it within the Geneva Convention. You have to do it in a way that allows for those that are part of the team that are protected, from, we'll say, lack of insight from decision makers. And there's been countless scenarios where I've watched squad leaders push back on something from a platoon leader or from a company commander, and that squad leader was right. And so the point here is the system that we have. As long as we understand the rules, as long as we understand the system works for us. The system works for the people. The system works for people who understand it best. And I think as that transitions over to the political world, we've got to make sure that we, the citizens, again, of the Republic, understand the rules and understand our rights, understand our responsibilities. One of the very first things that we get taught in the military is duty. Depending on your branch, you've got certain mottos, honor, courage, commitment, so on. And you've got to make sure that we understand the rules and we make sure that we enforce those rules, but we hold each other accountable to those rules as well. And again, this is where I see the overlap to a republic. I don't have any power over anybody else as a citizen, but I am willing and able to check that person and say, do you understand your rights and your responsibilities? What they do with it is what they do with it. I can't force them to do anything, but I can point out that they are falling short of their duties as a citizen. And I think that was always something that impressed me when that happened, peer to peer in the military. As a, they called it leadership outside of the rank structure, out of, rank outside of your, organizational structure. And, there was a lot of people that I respected because they knew the game, they knew the rules, and they didn't have a problem pushing back on a battalion commander. That was mind blowing to watch, but they knew what they were doing and they knew the rules, they knew their rights. Then they did a phenomenal job. And so really it's being technically and tactically competent. That's what we need to do here in this republic, is understand what we do, what we are.
Thank you. That's a friendly reminder. I wish many politicians, as we know with previous generations, there had been a large swath of the Congress and Senate were military veterans.
Yeah.
So that esprit de corps, as well as that professionality, was not only expected, it was the norm, and that has since been lost. So we
Yeah.
see some of that restoration with more military, especially officers in the ranks. They hold them to a higher standard because you hold yourselves to higher standards. So
Yeah.
we appreciate that in that perspective, and it's needed, which is why we love to see you make it there specifically, because that type of leadership is needed. So
Thank you.
next step will be council member Michael Krowitz. Congratulations, Michael is joining us from Geneva, Switzerland. He's been working on the WIPO treaty, protecting intellectual properties and genetics around the world. So welcome, Michael. You have our next question.
Thank you, Etienne. It's great to see you, Chris. Thank you for joining us again.
Likewise.
I guess this question is kind of a follow-up from the last time you were on. The question is simply what brought you to this decision to run again for Congress, but more than just that. Hopefully you can give us a little, behind the scenes peek of the decision-making process and, what it's like from your perspective to look at this choice and the landscape of your your political campaign out there.
Well, again, congratulations to you, and thanks for the question. There's so much that we go deep on in the campaign, and sometimes we move away from, that inception moment, that decision point, and it was definitely a long coming decision. It wasn't something I wanted to do. I didn't think about how I could fit myself in, and I guess to, as you said, kind of continue that last point. I realize that our country is on a dangerous path for a lot of reasons. And I I remember sitting and looking at everything that was going on, and this is 3 years ago, I think, 2021-ish. And we were looking at a pretty terrible economic situation. We were looking at continuing increases in chaos and unrest. We were watching, particularly here in the north coast of California, we were watching people losing their livelihoods, moving out, businesses closing. And then, in my sphere, the sphere that I could recognize that exists, I saw a lot of chaos and a lot of a serious lack of leadership that was happening. I mean, nothing's changed. Nothing. I'd say that this is an ongoing situation for many years, not just in a administration specifically, but there's this kind of community issue that I watched happen. And I'm a nerd. I love to focus on statistics and pay attention to things. A lot of my background is in policy, international policy, and so on. And so I watch a lot of the data, and I began to get the sense that the opportunities that we were building for the next generation were declining. It was not. It was going to me, intuitively, it felt like they were not going to have as much access to opportunity as my generation did. And then I started doing some research, and I found that every generation experiences roughly 20% less wealth than their parents' generation. And that is something that's continued for over 40 years now. And so, it's not a singular generation, but as you work it down percentage wise, 20% becomes less and less of what's remaining. And so I looked at my nieces and my nephews, and I realized that with all of the increases in living and costs of everything, add another 10, 20 years to that, and these kids will have no opportunities. There's nothing wrong with them. But, going back again to responsibilities and duties, I was a president of the Boy Scout Council here. So it's 2 counties, about 1,000 youth, and then 2,000 adult volunteers. And I got my Eagle Scout back in the 90s. And I remember coming home and thinking, this is only possible because of the people that did the work in the background when I was a young child. And they created the scenario that allowed me to even compete for an Eagle Scout, to even participate in the process, to get the merit badges, to go on the trips, to do X, Y, and Z. And without any of that, I would have never even had the opportunity. It would never have been anything to consider. And I believe, like many others, that becoming an Eagle Scout or participating in Boy Scouts saved my life. I would not be sitting in front of you running for Congress with a master's degree if I was not an Eagle Scout. And I know that for a fact. And so what I watched was that same concept of, if there hadn't been a bunch of volunteers doing things for me as a Boy Scout, as a boy, as a young man, that I would have never had the infrastructure, let's say, to accomplish that. And it's the same thing for each generation. My generation, the 40-year-olds, that, depending on how you look at it, I'm a millennial or a boomer, and Gen Xer, and yeah, thanks. An X. And so you think about how each preceding generation creates the opportunities for the following generation. And that is something that we don't often think about in our day-to-day lives because we're just trying to survive. And so I took that same kind of equation, without the inputs of those in the past, we do not have the present. And without the future, we don't have the inputs. We can't do the future without the inputs of the present. And so that, I think, was kind of the foundation for the decision. But one of the main things that really pushed me over the edge was that our current representative is trying to get rid of a major water source in Lake County, Mendocino County. And I realized that if that goes away, that not only our current generation, our current population, but the future populations of this entire region, including farmers, including cannabis farmers of the Emerald Triangle, including wineries, hospitality, restaurants, you name it. The overwhelming majority of the economy of this region of Northern California is gone. And I know that. It's not a guess. It's not an estimate. I know that it will be gone if we do not have water. And so that was the one, I think, main point that I just said, I cannot be here quietly. And so 80-year-old Chris said, you will regret not stepping in when you had the time and the energy and the capability. And so basically did the same thing that we all did in the, when we made our choices to go into the military. If not me, then who? And then I stood up.
As Samuel Clemens said, whiskey's for drinking, water's for fighting over.
Yep.
That never left me. It has really struck a chord with me living in California. And I agree. It's one of the things we have not done efficiently is trap the water sources that come to us naturally, and allowing them to leave us, and not realizing the populations or how far that water supports population, I think is more important than anything. And I'm looking at you, Los Angeles. All right. With that, we have a couple of follow-up questions. So Leslie, you're up.
Yeah. Hey, Chris. You were talking about how each generation has about 20% less wealth.
Yes.
Why do you think that is? And this is kind of a two-part question. I mean, we constantly hear about 1%, the 1% having all the wealth. What do you think about how to go about redistribution of wealth?
Well, I would very much love to answer the first part of that question in depth and in full. That is something that I love to nerd out on. The short answer of it is that we have basically destroyed what was once the U.S. currency, which is referred to as debt notes now. So one of the things that's happened is we've created access to debt rather than access to currency, access to actual dollars, if you will. And so what that does is it skews the economic system. And so you have basically an entire nation, if you will, at this point, that really has no economic literacy, no financial literacy. They do not understand the way that wealth actually occurs. What they learn is debt management. And not debt management in the way of like, watch how much your income and your outflow is. It is more, the people that are succeeding very, very well in business today are the ones that understand how to leverage debt, how to, take out, to buy a house and then take out a second on it and use that debt to then purchase a third house or a second house and continue this kind of creation of what are technically promissory notes, but they look at it as money. And so what now happens is your money supply has blown up. And then your money supply, because your money supply is so massive, your M1 and M2 is just massive. There's no value in the dollar itself. And then you have the skewing of goods and services. So if you look at the historical costs of technology, it's perpetually downward. But if you look at your costs of necessities, it's perpetually upward. So looking at your cost of food, it's going up and it will always go up because you have, still on topic of this, but separate, you have regulatory warfare that's been waged on small businesses. You now have a scenario that I liken to Trotskyism, where the state itself is controlling the allocation of capital at scale. And they are the ones, the state, and I'm speaking specifically at this point to the state of California, but I think in some ways it applies to the federal government. But the state government is one of the biggest influencers of where it is that capital is allocated and who gets access to it and who gets the ability to maneuver that capital with or without friction. And we can talk about how that has impacted the cannabis industry specifically, because they're a beautiful test case for the controls of regulatory power to create commerce, friction to commerce. And so you have these scenarios where you have an illiterate populace that doesn't understand debt management, they are, as business owners, saddled with insane amounts of regulatory bureaucracy, to the point where I would argue, not to put words in your mouth, but I would argue that most business owners, particularly those in the cannabis industry, spend the overwhelming majority of their time being something other than a business owner. They're more of a liability manager at this point. You're a compliance manager, you're a accounting manager, you're all of these other things that are not business. They're not generating revenue. And so what I think we're watching, all of that's kind of the preface to, we've got these small companies who have to spend the overwhelming majority of their time, one, trying to figure out this economic system. And because, we all show up at 18 and we think we know what's going on in the world, and then we're struck by reality. But you've got all of these things that you've got to do to make a business happen. And then all of a sudden, you've got more things that you've got to deal with where you're never actually spending time being a business owner. And so at your small businesses, which is 500 employees or less, according to the SBA, you've got your proportional amount of friction is so massive relative to the big players. So if you want to operate as Amazon, taking a significant hit, or if your cost of capital increases by 1%, you've got so much cash flow that you can override that technical loss in your profit margin. Whereas if you're a single dispensary and you have to go from paying a 60% tax to a 65% tax, plus you have to do all of the compliance, because if you screw up, you're going to get fined. Your ability to strategize, to build plans, to build team, to do all of the things that a business is also supposed to do to grow itself as an organization, your ability to do that is limited. And so, yeah, the idea is that your bigger players have a greater scale, which allows them to weather the storm greater than your small players. So what's happening is there's a redistribution of capital that's going into the bigger players because they can weather the Keynesian economic system, right? So as the cycle goes downward, all of these little guys that fall off, their capital then trickles over to the big players on the upward end. So I'm doing my best to keep that as concise as possible, but these are the things that I love talking about. And so what happens is basically there's less and less capital available to those that would then pass it on to the next generation. And you have the consolidation of wealth at the top, which in any economic system, in any system, there's always these kind of reversion processes. But what we're going to see happen, I think, and I know you didn't ask this part, but what's happening is the amount of capital that's controlled by institutions is so overwhelming to the economic system that we don't have sufficient economic velocity. And so because your BlackRocks and your Vanguards and your big players can't spend the money as efficiently and as effectively as all of your mid-sized businesses and your small businesses. So the amount of money that's transiting through the economic system, and it's not enough. And so now this bottom section gets choked out. And so you've got basically, your middle class, if you will, and down, that's dealing with less and less of capital availability. And so it's squeezing down, but that capital is being pressed up here. So taking this, this is the bottom or the top of the middle class, quote unquote. The rest of the capital is here in the 1%. And so that remaining crust is what everybody's fighting over at this point. And I would argue it's by design. So I hope that answered your question. Okay. And then there was a second part.
What was the second part, Leslie?
No, Michael.
Oh,
yeah.
I was going to say you kind of answered it.
Okay.
The second part was more about the 1% and how to redistribute it, and just how it resulted in that manner. So
Sure.
I appreciate all that detail.
Yeah. The way that I would argue is best redistributed. I don't want to call it redistribution, but the way that I think it is best to make sure that there's sufficient capital is that I've got a bill written, and we're going to touch on one of the bills, but the first bill that I've got written is the suspension of the federal income tax on the first $182,000 for 5 years for all Americans, $400,000 for couples. And the idea there is that we, as Americans, actually can't afford to be American at this point. And part of the reason is that we're giving up between 20 and 40+% of our income to a government who, by all measures, and I'm talking the federal government at this point, by all measures, has never successfully accomplished a program that it's taken trillions of our dollars and created trillions of dollars of debt to do. Name me a government program that has been successfully concluded. And the military is not part of the government. Let's make sure we remember that. So the point is that we allow Americans to keep the money that they earn. That money will reside within local economies. It will help stimulate local businesses, create more jobs. And it does all of this without creating new government jobs or requirements or anything. All it is an automatic deduction of the first $182,000 of income. And the rest of the tax code remains the same, over $183,000. Everything else stays in place. And if you look at Laffer's curve, there's a lot of different economic studies out there that prove that the more money that's available inside of an economic system, the greater the economic activity, the greater the economic growth. Because a government can never allocate capital more efficiently than an individual. It's just not possible. So to answer that part of the question, that is the way that I think it would be best done. And I think that what we would see is that the total amount of revenue not collected, which is different than revenue lost, because one, it's not revenue, and two, it's not, we're not obligated to give it to them, particularly when they're in breach of contract. So the idea is that we keep our income, spend it, and that way we can actually grow our wealth, grow our abilities to be economically secure. So that's the proposal I have in motion.
Well, how
Thank
dare
you.
you be so logical and intelligent in your discussions. I'm not sure Americans are ready to handle that. Councilmember Landau is actually a California cannabis businessman and knows the ins and outs, and he has a follow-up as well.
Okay.
Hey, the way you described it, yes, I feel like I don't grow my business. I'm just fighting with regulators all the time, and I don't want to. My follow-up question is, you struck me with when you say that the Boy Scouts kind of saved your life. I feel kind of the problem with our country right now is the lack of community. I would say, what would you do that to promote community? It seemed like the Boy Scouts was the one thing that kind of gave you an anchor in your life. What would you do to help promote community again? Because I think that's something missing. We kind of had it with our church or synagogue. We don't have that anymore. So what would your answer be?
Well, this is another fun one for me, but we've kind of touched and stayed on this theme the whole time, but I was very, very lucky to grow up. I joined Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts on my own as a very young boy, like 6 or 7. I thought I did it on my own, but I'm pretty sure my family was watching me do it. But yeah. So I've always been in a moderately structured environment that very much relied on the hierarchy of experience over the attachment of those that are looking for experience to those that have the experience. So whether that's a young boy or an older boy following a young man who's in scouting that's teaching him the ropes and showing him things, and then all of this is done under the guidance of parents. The studies show that those type of structures, whether it be scouting or sports, have massive positive impacts on the success of a child into their adult life. And then if you combine the two, scouting and sports, then your percentage of likelihood for success is even higher. And so I think a lot of what we're watching is the dislocation of people, the dislocation of humanity, whether that's through social media or just our scenarios where we're not communicating with each other in person. We are human beings, and we have so many ways for us to interface, not just visually, but there's a lot of things that we can pick up from an individual by actually talking to them and living within a community and knowing that we're responsible, for making sure that everybody is going to be well taken care of in the hard times. It's not something that it's a law, but it's certainly a part of the natural law, I think, is that we've got to be forward thinking. We've got to make sure that we're doing the things that we're thinking about the next generation. There's a lot of Native philosophies where you think 8 generations into the future, how does this impact them? I think those are phenomenal. But I would encourage the involvement in any of these organizations that imbue character, that focus on developing character under fire. And I mean that metaphorically in this scenario, but as a kid, what we look at as adults today that we see probably not a whole lot. Sometimes just a kid saying no is a breakthrough moment in their character development, and they've got to know that there's people standing behind them. And sadly, and I know this isn't necessarily in the scope, but sadly, I think we're watching the destruction of the family unit. I think we're watching the destruction of the manner in which we treat each other. I think we're watching an assault on women. I think we're watching an assault on men. I think there's a lot of divisiveness that's going on in a way that we, whoever it is that we have to stand up. I think it's appalling what's happening in women's sports, and I don't have anything to do with women's sports, but if I just sit here quietly, who am I? I'm saying okay to that, and I can't do that. There's plenty of other options. If you want to compete against the opposite sex, there's co-ed. Go for it. That's fine. And everybody has that chance. So, I think as long as we are willing to speak the truth, then we will move towards a better future faster. But as we continue to play these games and play niceties, it's going to keep repelling us back. There's a phrase that always repeats in my head: tyranny kills truth and truth kills tyranny. And I believe that the only way that we can help create the structures, these social structures again, is to start speaking truths. And that's, that starts with teaching the young generation what the truth is. If we don't, then they're going to be even more lost than we are. And metaphorically speaking, there's more than one definition of wealth, and there's health as wealth. Yeah, but truth, I think, is a measure of wealth as well. Because if you live in a world of lies, then what do you have? So, I think my generation, at least, has a huge responsibility to stand up and start taking care of these young kids and showing them the way. Because right now, the way that the system is set up, parents oftentimes are so inundated with just making sure that they can pay for things. They got to do their regular job, then they got to take Johnny to the to baseball practice, and then they got to do something else and do something else. And by the time that they're getting home, they're burned. They don't have any brain processing power left because they're just trying to survive. And I think that that's been a real problem for America since roughly 2008, 2009, and it's just it's gotten worse. We kind of started to get better for a little bit, and then COVID hit and lockdowns happened, and everybody kind of got to sit. Some people got to sit, some people got overworked, but we kind of splintered at that point, it seems like. And now we've got to get the kids, we got to get them straightened out because we kind of went amok. And so, I'm saying all of this without any kids, but I got nieces and nephews, and I look at what they're doing, and then I think they're going to be perfectly fine, but they don't have, not everybody's got that opportunity that they have, and that's on us. That's our responsibility. We can't let them raise themselves. So I hope that answered the question. I know I went off tangent a little bit, but.
Well, many issues touch on different things. So there is another follow-up. Michael Crowitz was wondering specifically, what is the reasoning given for wanting to remove the water source you were talking about originally?
Yeah, the current representative is arguing that the existence of the dam, which provides water supply for 600,000 people, his argument is that dam removes the access of salmon to another 10% of their watershed. So they want to spend $400 million so that we don't have access to 26 billion gallons of fresh water, so that the fish can get around the dam and get access to another 10%. And I think it's a $20 million fish ladder build, but instead we're going to do a $400 million dam destruction. The other argument is that the dam is seismically unsound. The unfortunate scenario here in California is that 80% of all of our dams are seismically unsound because it's California. Yeah. So it's kind of a moot point. And it's insane to me to think that a species would willingly destroy a water supply and pay for it, and then try and argue that it's a good idea to get rid of it. But I know that in California, if that dam goes away, it's never coming back. It will not come back, not in my lifetime, and I'm only 42. So that is something where we have to have a plan first. You don't hold your breath and go underwater without having a plan where you're going to come up for for oxygen. So that just does not strike me as sensible and lacks vision.
Mike was saying we could probably hire a concierge service to pick up the fish and bring them
Move them, yeah, for $400 million. Yeah.
paper.
Yeah.
Anyway, next, let's move on to our next question. Council member Peggy Jones is up next with that.
Thank you, Etienne. Thank you, Chris, for joining us this evening.
My
My question
pleasure.
is, why should someone in the district you're running for vote for you over the current incumbent? Thank you.
Thank you. So there's a lot of different reasons. There's many, many reasons. More relevant, I think, to this topic or to this discussion, this panel, is he's been the representative of the Emerald Triangle for 12 years. How far have we moved forward at the federal level in the last 12 years with this representative for cannabis? Why is the person that represents the heartland of cannabis not the one championing cannabis why is the person that's representing this district, this Emerald Triangle, not the one leading the charge for either the descheduling of cannabis or the legalization of cannabis? He hasn't done anything, hasn't said anything. Actually, what he said was he was told not to vote for it. And the question is, who told him not to vote for it? Because it wasn't any of us in his constituency. So, yeah, who told you? Because I don't know who it is that gives orders to a representative other than the people. Who told you not to vote, and what's her name? Because I know who it is. So the question is why is our representative not representing us? Why is he not representing the cannabis industry, one of the major industries of his district? And why are so many people leaving this district for economic reasons? Why are we not in a golden era for California? Why are we not doing better? Why is our current representative not solving the problems of small businesses? Why do we not have someone stepping in here? Right now, we've got a local ballot measure for the county of Sonoma, and it's the only one of its kind in the entire nation. And the goal of the ballot measure is to end what they call factory farming, which is just defined by a certain size. But it would shut down dozens of small farms here in Sonoma County. Everybody makes a big deal about go local, buy local, and do all these things. But now we've got a ballot measure from people outside of the county who are trying to get the people from within the county to vote in favor of shutting down our food supply chain. Not a word from our representative. So we're heavy ag, particularly in Sonoma County North. I mean, we've got dairies, ranches. You look around, it's vineyards for miles, and then behind the vineyards are cattle, and then we've got massive forests and so on. So we're heavy ag, but we're getting no support from the person that's supposed to be our representative. I think on a bigger picture, as we look at it from a national level, we look at some of the top issues that we're facing as a country. We're looking at massive economic issues. We're looking at China and the BRICS attempting to de-dollarize the rest of the world. They want to basically help continue the destruction of the dollar so that they can make an easier entry of their own new currency that they claim will be backed by gold. I don't think that most people in our Congress are tracking this, are aware of it, or making action to change this path. I'm not talking about Democrats. I'm talking about Congress. I'm talking about everybody. Like, this is our country. and we have economic warfare being waged on us. And if we're going to change that, if we're going to fix that, if we're going to ensure a better country for the next generation, then we've got to address that. And I don't see any indication that our current representative has the technical skills or the knowledge base to, one, identify that, two, assess it, and three, come up with a solution and lead that solution to fruition in Congress. So nothing I've seen from him indicates he has economic savvy. He has no business experience whatsoever. So we're watching small businesses perish. But we don't have anybody really in Congress, at least in the House, that's really leading the charge on behalf of small businesses. I'm a small business owner. I've dealt with that on several different industries, including the cannabis industry. And I wouldn't wish the experience I had in cannabis industry on anybody. And that was supposed to be a big opportunity. So there's a multitude of reasons why I got involved and running against him. And I know I can do better than him, and I'm ready to put my name on that and step forward, because again, if you see a problem and you do nothing about it, then who are you? So I think America is at a point where we are all frustrated and we are all upset, and we need to get some adults in the room. And if that's got to be me, here I am.
I do want you to keep an eye out for interstate commerce if you're able to take that next step, because I think more than anything, the Emerald Triangle could definitely benefit exponentially by having the access. The limitations, of course, in California, we are allowed to have certain dry counties as opposed to proliferous counties, and unfortunately, they're peppered throughout, and it leaves millions of current Californians out of access in their, within a reasonable area concern, etc. So
Right.
that has driven the problem definitely with the Northern California market spreading throughout throughout California itself. However, with the discussions as we have seen between California, Oregon, and Washington State, wanting to go that route. And if that were to be the case, I could see that definitely being a savior to the Emerald Triangle itself, because of its known historical knowledge. Michael Crowitz has worked on protecting, regional protections such as, Humboldt grown, Sonoma grown, etc.
Appalachians. Yep.
Appellations are very important and need to be remembered. So
Very much so.
don't forget to carry these things forward in your discussions, because they're very important and key discussions to those demographics of the wineries and cannabis alike. So,
Very much
Councilmember
so.
Peggy Jones has another follow-up.
Yeah.
So you mentioned cannabis. As far as that's a hot topic right now with the rescheduling going on with the DEA. Where do you personally stand? Do you think it should be just rescheduled, or do you think believe it should be descheduled, and why?
Oh, it should be completely legalized. It's the only thing that makes any sense at all. The issue is that we've got too many people getting paid too much money to play too many games. And I think, we've got a lot of people in Congress who have no conceptualization of what cannabis really is. They have no idea about the community, the industry, whatever term you want to use. And I don't see many of them ready to take the lead on it. Again, likely because they were told by their leadership not to. I think the Republicans shy away from it because historically they were supposed to be against it, and they're supposed to be the party of law and order. But if we are, as Republicans, the party of law and order, and it was voted on using the democratic process, and it is now lawful, then it is our job as the party of law and order to lead the charge to help that small business, because we are also supposed to be the party that protects small businesses. So the Republican Party should be the ones leading the charge on cannabis legalization now. I mean, we've seen the vote by the people across the states. It's overwhelming. And so at this point, all we're doing is waiting for the big sharks to basically set us up and destroy the small businesses of the cannabis industry. That's what all these delays are at this point. And I understand who I'm talking to, and I'm more than happy to articulate why I think that's the case. But what's happening is this process of rescheduling is creating more time where I think the Democrats are dangling the carrot in front of those that they believe that they're losing. You know, let's take for an example, California industry. Overwhelmingly, those involved in the cannabis industry were historically Democrats, because from 96 on, the Democrats were always promising that they'd be the ones that did legalization. Well, be careful what you ask for and be careful who you ask it from. Then what ended up happening is the Democrats didn't actually even get it over the line. They put it to a ballot. They put it to a vote of the people. But what a lot of people don't know is that Gavin Newsom was the architect of Prop 64. He's the one that wrote it all. I mean, there are obviously other people giving inputs and so on, but he was the chair of the Blue Ribbon group that put the whole thing together. And so all of these things that the Democratic Party said that they were going to do on behalf of the cannabis industry, which kept, I think, a lot of people in the Democratic Party that were aligned with cannabis, was under this false premise or false promise that the Democrats would be the ones to do it. All I see is the same exact thing happening now today that basically happened in California from 96 to 2016, 18, depending on how you want to cut it. And I think what we're going to see is total destruction of small and medium-sized cannabis businesses across the United States once this whole thing rolls out. And I'm saddened to watch it happen. I think that there's ways to do it, but it requires people like me to be in Congress. It requires cannabis industry, and it requires the Republican Party to see what's going on and to take action. And as someone who's supported by the Republican Party and running as a Republican on the ballot, there is an opportunity for us to do that. And my proposal is that give the Republican Party and give certain Republican candidates a chance to protect and represent the cannabis industry. And let's see what happens with that. Because as I see it right now, it can't get any worse. I mean, at the state level.
Correct. It was a good idea. Unfortunately, the legislature ran amok with it. And I think one of the major components that shifted things was the lobbying to remove the protections for 5 years of small farmers. Was absolutely
Yeah.
devastating to the entire industry as a whole. And
I agree.
my dispensary itself is the oldest dispensary in America, going on 25 years. Absolutely, yeah, it changed things exponentially in a way that none of us anticipated or want to see.
Yeah.
But you know, that's we're now the learning lesson for people to learn not what to, you know, how not to do things.
Yeah.
Sometimes being an example of how not to do things is the example. Next, Leslie, you're up with our next question. Councilmember Freeze, you're up.
Yeah, Chris, to stay on the topic of descheduling, what do you think of the proposed descheduling bill by Schumer and Booker?
I think it's hot garbage.
Elaborate on that garbage.
Yeah. Obviously, there's always good elements to most any bill. There's the obvious nuts and bolts that need to happen, the reframing of language and so on. But exactly at the heart of this whole thing, this massive, I don't even know how many pages, but I've read it twice now. Eventually, the whole thing scales from a 10% tax all the way up to a 25% tax. So if you are a cannabis industry, exactly, could you elaborate? But the whole thing scales to a point where if you're an operator, a licensed operator in the state of California, you're looking at 85% tax. 85% tax. Please tell me, who survives an 85% tax regime? Nobody. Yeah. You want to, is that a follow-up?
Follow up?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about how the hemp industry's been selling THCA flower. I mean, marijuana mislabeled as hemp, and
Right.
paying definitely not the taxes that the marijuana regulated companies are paying.
Right.
What do you think of all that? And do you think that's a good argument to say, hey, we should just go ahead and deschedule because it's happening and we need to tax it better than what it is?
Yeah. I mean, this is the small R Republican in me. As a business, your job is to basically figure out how to survive. So I don't necessarily begrudge the hemp industry on what they're doing. But the other side of it is it's a terrible, terrible situation because the government has, and this is why I actually think the government made the move to move forward with rescheduling just to do something because they realized that they were getting a loophole run on them to a degree which they were basically losing control of and had no ability to regulate, tax, and so on. And so I think that was one of the major forcing mechanisms that drove the rescheduling process. And then the election year and dangling the carrot. But I think that what the hemp industry did was actually a catalyst for the rescheduling, part of the catalyst for rescheduling. And so I agree that it's a great argument. Why don't we just let cannabis do the same thing? And I think the logical statement is, yeah, we should. The reality of our world and this bureaucracy, which determines its own success and failures and has to always insert itself in everything. Otherwise, what good is it in its own eyes? They would never let that happen because that would give too much room to the industry to determine its own future, to shape its own existence. And that's not what they want to do. And this is one of the scenarios that you have to look at using the cannabis scenario as an example. Excuse me, the California scenario for cannabis as an example. Most industries show up and start out with arguably zero regulations. And then over time, that grows. But during the period in which you have zero regulations is arguably your greatest earning period. So you have like your startup phase when, it's just Wild West, everything's going, accumulate as much capital as possible. And then a regulation comes in, hey, you can't use children to clean your machines, you run your sewing companies in New York anymore. Um, you know, and eventually more and more of these regulations come on board. Some of them make sense. Others are just onerous by design. But as we went forward, you get to a point where if you think about, for example, the airline industry, could the airline industry day one survive the regulatory regime that they exist under today? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And so without going too far down the road, what happens is you basically have an industry show up day one with almost 100% regulatory framework at hand. And I think that is one of the things that the federal government wants to make sure that they do. They want to take everything that we had to do at a state level, then they're going to stack that with the DEA licensing. Because my understanding is that with Schedule 3, it requires you to get licensed by the DEA for your production, distribution, manufacturing, and sales, retail sales. So how long is that process going to take? How many people are going to get through that process in a reasonable period of time? How much capital is going to be expended before that actually becomes a commercial viable commercial endeavor? So I think we're sitting in a very precarious situation. I don't know why a lot of organizations are saying that this movement to Schedule 3 is a good thing. And I can be wrong. I definitely still have more reading to do. I recognize the 280E element to it, but that seems like kind of loosening the noose before you kick the the stool out from underneath it. It's like, we'll ease up on that a little bit, and then, well, by the way, you're never going to get licensed at the federal level because you don't have whatever they want you to have. So Yeah, I hope that answers the question.
Follow up, Leslie?
Yeah. Chris, I mean, do you truly think that THCA hemp flower is a loophole, or do you think it's just a fib?
Well, I can't get into the compound side of things. I don't know that. I'm not that well versed in it, but the reason I think it's a loophole is because the way they defined cannabis and hemp. And so what they're doing is they're basically it's I know I'm pretty sure nobody wants me to use this example, but it's the only one I can come up with. But like the synthetic cannabis back in the day, it wasn't illegal because it didn't meet the definition of cannabis. So it's that same type of loophole. So you had people selling something that was very dangerous, but it wasn't actually listed as a dangerous item. So therefore it wasn't a dangerous item. And so that's why I refer to that as like as a loophole. So it's a legal loophole in the technicalities of a definition. And so that's what's allowing them to operate with impunity at this point. I shouldn't say impunity, but allow them to operate without the same restrictions that many of the other licensed operators are.
I think impunity is applicable at this particular juncture. But yeah, I mean, taxation, going about what you were speaking about before, is a reality. And currently, we're going to have to lobby next year in California because now Gavin wants a 19% tax on top of the 15% tax that we already have. So he wants to raise that tax. And of course, the 25% tax that, Schumer and them are talking about is the same thing we told them was a non-starter 5 years ago. Because actually today Facebook reminded me that 5 years ago today I was on Capitol Hill lobbying, and of course I was telling various constituency that 25% was not going to work for us. And Booker's office pushed back saying, well, you'll just adjust things within the state that you're in. And that's just not the case. That's just not a reality. And yeah, it's a frustration to many of us that, of course, the pay to play status is only for those who can afford to. And that, of course, it strangles us small businesses and medium sized businesses out of the ability ever to compete. And adding that type of taxation on top of the onerous regulations is, yeah, a reason why cannabis has become a cautionary tale, and why many of us tell people not to get into the cannabis industry because yeah, it's problem. All
Yep.
right, so thank you for that. Next up will be Council Member Wade Laughter. Good to see you, Wade. You're up with your next question.
Yes, thank you for joining us this afternoon, Chris. I just got to say before I ask you my question, I really appreciated the lucid, thoughtful way that you have responded to the questions that we have asked. And I really wish there were more elected representatives like you. So may you
Do my
win your
best.
election.
Thank you.
If I was in your district, I would likely vote for you despite you being a Republican. I'm a lifelong Democrat.
Okay, I'll take
That's
that.
a whole nother different conversation that we
Yeah.
always stay away from in this group.
No worries.
And yes, the conversation around cannabis is sticky and uncomfortable for all of us because it's so messed up here in California.
Yes.
As you know, and have very beautifully described. So my question is maybe a change of pace and maybe some upbeat news. Can you tell us more about the Veterans Economic Freedom Act?
Absolutely. I'm very
Cheers.
excited about this one. We're watching so many people struggle economically. We're watching a lot of veterans end up homeless for various reasons. And going back to part of the conversation that we had earlier today, one of the purposes of a republic is to ensure economic sovereignty, is to ensure the economic security for the citizens of that republic. And if there's any subgroup that deserves to have economic security in this country, it is those that sacrifice and are prepared to give their life on behalf of it. And so my bill basically exempts federal income tax for any honorably served veteran or those on active duty. So any person who served on active duty or is on active duty will be exempt from federal income tax on the first $182,000 for life. And the idea is that this guarantees that they will have the money necessary basically to, to be a fully functioning American that they were ready to die for. And why, after 248 years, are veterans and active duty members paying taxes that are supposed to be paying their wages? So that bill, I think, is one of the most important things that we can do for veterans. We don't need another $50 billion to go to the VA system that's just kind of disappear. We don't need more government programs. What we need is people to have economic security. And you think about how much the American individual has done over the last, I will argue, 400 years, 1621 to today. How much have we produced? Who has produced more than us? Who? And that is, I think, at some point, an accolade that we need to stand on. We have done a great deal of good for the world in some respects. That, some of that is debatable, but I know that there has been some good that America has done over the last, say, 248 years. And I think that we owe it to those veterans to have a healthy, happy life that doesn't require them to ask their government for help, just to live, just to exist. So this is a very exciting bill for me that I'm very excited to actually be able to submit. This will be between that and the American Economic Freedom Act. Those two bills will be the very first two bills that I submit on the floor when I get into Congress.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
Next up will be Council Member Nate Landau. Council Member Landau, you're recognized.
So, apologize for the background noise. Former President Trump seems to be testing our Constitution. He made the denial of the election a cornerstone of his campaign and a litmus test for those who would join his ranks. Do you believe that the 2020 election was stolen? That's the first part. Do you believe that the peaceful transition of power is a cornerstone of our democracy, as some have stated? Thank you.
Sure. I'll start with the second part first. No, I don't. Because we are not a democracy. We do not have peaceful transfers of power within our democracy because we are not a democracy. We are a republic. We are a republic that uses the democratic process to establish our office holders. And so that is one point that I disagree with, but to the main purpose of your question, yes, the peaceful transfer of power is a requirement to our republic. But I would argue that that peaceful transfer of power is hinged on the accuracy of our voting process, of the democratic process. And I would say that we have, as citizens, I think that we get our discourse framed by certain people, by people that benefit from us not having the real conversations. So we have this conversation that's really been kind of a talking point largely for the left about Trump's claims on the 2020 election. But arguably, we need to step back from our lens as Democrats and Republicans and remember that regardless of our party, we are Americans. And we need to look at things like this and with the lens of the American eye. Why are we only talking about 2020? Why is that the litmus test? Why aren't we looking at 2016? Why aren't we looking at 2012? Why aren't we looking at 2008? Why aren't we looking at 2004? Why aren't we looking at 2020 or 2000? Why aren't we asking, since the hanging Chad, why it is that we're just moving on? Because the peaceful transfer of power happens when both sides accept the results. And if both sides do not accept the results because they do not accept the accuracy of the process, that's not an indication necessarily of a party. It's an indication of the failure of a process. And we need to start looking at things as Americans and protecting the processes and the institutions of the republic, because this is the institution that protects us as individuals. And if we are willing to let a party do something that is unconstitutional, whatever the party, it doesn't matter. But if we're allowing a party to do something that's unconstitutional because it benefits our party, we have damaged the republic. You cannot let your party win without causing your country to lose. And that's where I start to push back on these conversations, because we get very myopic in this, and we're getting trained and programmed to be like, well, if you don't agree that 2020 was stolen, then you're this, that, or the other, and if you do agree, then you're this, that, or the other. But we're missing the bigger problem here as citizens. Why aren't we saying that there needs to be a better way? Why aren't we moving forward with the same vociferousness, the same aggressiveness that we're attacking each other on over, this party's play or that party's play? Why are we doing this when we should both be doing this? We should be both looking at the people who are telling us what the elections are. Don't tell me what the election is. Show me what the result is, because I want to trust it. I want to know for a fact that this outcome is accurate, because, not trying to keep every answer heavy, but we've got to make sure that we look at all of this in context. Many of us served overseas, and we saw those that were not able to vote. We saw what that looked like. We know what it means to not have a voice politically. We've seen it with our own eyes. We've gone places where we implemented a voting process. Maybe it was real, maybe it wasn't real. There was a bunch of people with purple fingers. And we've done this, but we're in a situation at this point where we, the people, better start demanding more accurate outcomes. There shouldn't be this scenario where we're watching videos of people dumping, unidentified ballots from unknown locations and saying, well, my guy won, so I'm okay with that. Or, whatever the claims were by Hillary Clinton in 2016, or whatever the claims were in 2012 and 2008. Because every single election that we've had in this millennium have all been contested. Why are we, the people, not talking about that? That's my question. Why are we getting worked up over, somebody's name affiliated with this outcome? And I would argue, and I would ask each of you to consider heavily, very heavily, do you know? Do you know who won? Do you? Because I've never seen it. I've never seen the numbers. I'm talking not just about 2020. I'm not talking about 2016. Like, how is it that Chris, sitting here in this spot, has verified the accuracy of any election in the last 20 years, 24 years? How do you know? And it's supposed to be somewhat rhetorical. And I'm saying this so that people start thinking about the next election. I mean, it doesn't matter to me. That's in the past. We've got to start looking at the future. How am I going to look at the next generation and say, yes, this one won? Because it doesn't matter if Trump wins in 2024. If it's illegitimate, we've all lost. I mean, it doesn't matter who wins. What I'm talking about is beyond parties. What I'm talking about is our country. What I'm talking about is our republic. The point isn't who wins. The point is the accuracy of the process is what I'm trying to get across. And we, the people, don't know that. We don't have that system to know for a fact. And the reason, again, why we have peaceful transfers of power in America is because people are willing to accept the answer. But at some point, you're going to have to show your work. And that, I think, is where we should all, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, where we should all be focusing. We got to get away from the names and start working on the processes. That's my argument on that topic, and I'm keeping it bigger because
it makes a lot of sense. And I will point to myself because I, oddly enough, am an actual example of exactly what you're talking about. And let me enlighten you. My dispensary, right? The oldest dispensary in California, wanted its actual business permit. So we had to go through the initiative process in the city of Berkeley. In the city of Berkeley, we ended up losing by less than 1% of the vote. If you're within that margin, you can then and therefore pay for a recount.
Yep.
We 3 dispensaries at the time paid for that, went through the process. This is 2004. So just to give you, this is 20 years ago, the process for me started. And we did not realize at that time that it would start a 4-year legal fight. BPG via 2 of my employees who sued Diebold and the county of Alameda ended up winning because Diebold nor Alameda County could provide, please try not to laugh, the 420 voting machines in the county of Alameda. And because of that, they lost their case and we won and were able to get our business permit ask put back on the ballot by the judge in 2008. And we would end up winning by 64% of the vote. And
Right.
in the spring of 2009 is how BPG got its first actual cannabis business permit from the city of Berkeley. So inadvertently, what started off as a small local election turned out to be, in the end, we won the right for every American to look inside every voting machine, because Diebold said we could not look inside the individual voting machine. We could look at the machine that they downloaded everything into, but we could not look inside the individual voting machine. And so inadvertently, we had to use the court system and we won that right. So you and every American have that right because of Mike Goodbar and Donald Tolbert, who took it all the way through court and won on standing. And so there's just a small snippet of going back, and I agree, 2000, I think, is the most important election that isn't talked about, because if Gore had won in comparison to Bush, I mean, you can
Extrapolate.
would you be a combat veteran today from your experiences there? I'm not sure that would necessarily be the case. We could hem and haw over the futures
Right.
here and there, but
No,
I
we all
think
know it would be different.
definitely answered a question that's usually been answered on surface. But you touched me because I have been through the process just trying to establish a fair election. And I watched with horror in the city of Berkeley as they were tossing individual ballots because, oh, this is a student, so they're transient. Well, they're registered, they're there, they should be an actual thing. So you are correct. There is a process that we do not know. And it horrified and terrified me as a person who paid for a physical recount and watched that recount go down, that would then go into a 4-year legal fight. Not anything we asked for, but this is the accountability that we don't know even at the local election level. And this is in liberal Berkeley. Right? You know, a lot of the policies that spurn from here go throughout the United States. We have a lot of social policies. We have some dumb ones too, don't get me wrong, but at the same time, we are trendsetters and have established that. But the inability to certify and have true and fair elections, I think, is something I would like us, when you mentioned the purple fingers, I would like to go back to actually that and actually have my purple finger as opposed to electronically vote, because I know and saw and have been through a prolonged case where Diebold, after we beat them, changed their name to Election Services, whatever. That's how much of a black eye it was for them, but how frustrating it was that it took just a couple of citizens asking to look inside a standard voting machine and had to take that type of fight to accomplish just a simple question that would answer exactly what you stated. Was that right? Was that a correct election? Did I really win? because in the end, they said I lost by 86 votes. And I'm fine if I lost by 86 votes. So be it. I tried, I took it to the people. But being unable to unearth that led to a Scooby-Doo mystery that inadvertently changed law in the United States forever. So thank you for taking the time to not bat it around like it's a typical pinata, and break down the understanding, I think, better and more encapsulated than I think the answer we were anticipating, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I agreed. I mean, and I'm very grateful that you took the time to go through that, because you probably also changed the trajectory of the United States just by that little move, but not little as in, insignificant, but among the entire sea of what we've had to deal with. And just the thing that I want to point out to you is you doggedly chase that down.
You have to.
You have to.
It's part of our duties as citizens, right? I think Frank Zappa said best how a long time ago, how we as citizens have neglected our civic duty to participate in our democracy at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. We work at the international level as well, so it takes a different depth understanding of discourse when you're playing, diplomat status, but it still has its bearing even at the local level, because as you came down to, it's about communication, it's about understanding communication, but also having the confidence in the outcome so that it can be communicated effectively.
Yes. And I think to summarize the point, I'm not focusing on the fouls. I'm focusing on the referee.
Good point. And
Yeah.
that's a very deft take, and we appreciate it greatly.
So
And I can't thank you enough for taking the time with us today. With that, this is kind of gonna wrap us up.
yeah.
Let's see, let me get back to the gallery view. There we go. We lost Michael. Of course, he's in Geneva, Switzerland, so they're wrapping things up. So we want to congratulate that team there. We want to thank Leslie Fries, Peggy Jones, Nate Landau, council members Wade Laughter as well, myself, Etienne Fontan. And thank you, Chris, for taking the time again. We again wish you success in your endeavors and in your election, and we will be monitoring it to see how things go. And either way it goes, please come back and check in with us. We appreciate you, and as veterans, we appreciate you taking the further step in your civic duties to elevate yourself, and we wish you success. So tell the people how they can get a hold of you, or if they want to support your campaign. This is your chance to shoot your shot.
Okay. Well, thank you everybody for taking the time this evening. I appreciate the questions and the engagement, and I think the discourse is the way that we move this country forward. We have to be able to do that, otherwise we are lost. But for those that would love to learn more, you can find my website at chris2congress.com, all spelled out, chris2congress.com. And then on all of the platforms, I'm at Chris2Congress, Chris2 Congress. And I'm constantly putting out more information. We're less than 6 months away. So I'm continually going to put out a lot more content, and I can't turn my camera, but I've got a whole board of things that are ready to come forward. So I look forward to sharing that with each of you. And thank you again for your time. And I congratulate you on your success at WIPO, and look forward to many more.
All righty. Well, everybody, thank you, everybody, for joining us for our V.A.C. Roundtable number 76. Chris Coulombe. Have a great day,
Thank you.
everybody. All right. Good job.